Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have another fantastic and incredible episode for you guys. So hopefully you enjoy. Some people who maybe take the new Greer head pledge, not the old Greer head pledge, may have watched the Super Bowl last night and you can't believe it, but the deep state rigged it. It's incredible what the deep state is up to with the game, with the Chiefs somehow winning. They even tried to get Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift's boyfriend, to score the winning touchdown. There was a few times where he almost nearly did so, but he did not score the game-winning touchdown. Almost. What I played, I should have placed a bet, that Kelce will score a game-winning touchdown, Taylor Swift will calm down, and then they will say, the deep state has ordered us to tell everyone to vote for Biden, and that would have been the game. No, I'm not. And there is a little bit of, it's one of the few conspiracy theories I will believe in, that they did try to help the Chiefs win to get to the Super Bowl, because it's massive for the ratings to have Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift's boyfriend, his team to win the Super Bowl, because there's so much attention to the game now. There was it was a pretty high percentage of people are now watching NFL just because Taylor Swift's there, mainly women, of course. So there is, they want to reward the audience. They're not going to have the Chiefs be knocked out in the wild card round and then, ensure that they, that's not going to mean that they have money ratings. I would imagine that it's probably the highest ratings. But there were old believers in the Greer Head Pledge. This is like the Orthodox Church between the old believers and new believers. With that, there were some changes in the Orthodox Church at some point. I think it was like the 16th century. I'm not that great with Orthodox history, but then there was this group that were like the old believers who were like stuck in the old ways, and then the Orthodox Church came down hard on them. That's like the Greerhead believers, the old Greerhead pledgers who insist that they're not watching the NFL, even though the Pope, which in the Greerhead religion would be me. They're defying the Pope and going with the old one. Maybe I've been replaced by the deep state of some sort to get them to watch the NFL. But no, it's out of the Super Bowl. This is just some initial thoughts. We're going to get into our main topic about Biden and him running, because it involves that. Compared to like most of the commercials, I think the foot washing ad with the Christian foot washing ad was probably the only really egregious one. Some of the stuff you're just so used to, it's like, oh, mixed race family, gay couple. You kind of just, these are things so prevalent in advertising that you don't quite realize it anymore. There was a ad where there was a white dad with his mixed race daughter, and they finally bond over the NFL due to her getting into Taylor Swift. They're like seeing that Taylor Swift's now watching the NFL, and so they're both watching the game together. And before, she's like, I hate you, Dad. I have no respect for you. And the fat white dad's like, come on, daughter. And the funny thing is, it's based on a real story that they stole it from a TikToker, where it's a white guy with his black stepdaughter, not mixed race, and they're doing like things together and bonding over football. And they stole the storyline from that, which shows that like maybe the advertising, people saying like, oh, maybe there's too many interracial couples, which is true. It's like way higher than the actual population, but real life is starting to reflect advertising to an extent, unfortunately. So that's like one of the things. But the game itself, there's also other things that are so just like part of the game that you don't notice. Like, in racism is still in the end zone. It's like, what the hell is that doing there? They're still playing the Black National Anthem, which people have not really adopted to the Black National Anthem. Anytime they play it, it's the most awkward setting in the stadium. Like, the people are looking around. All the whites are just like, what am I supposed to do? Am I putting my hand over my heart? What am I? I definitely have to stand up for this. I can't kneel. And it is, I guess it's a little bit of a white pill that, we haven't really taken to this stuff. Is a lot of this stuff, especially compared to other sports, even the NBA doesn't do this stuff anymore. It really feels like a holdover from 2020 and 2021 that all this shit is there, and they haven't removed it yet. It's like taking a time machine to 2020. I wonder if they're not going to get rid of the black national anthem, but I wonder if they will finally get rid of the end racism stuff in the end zone, because it does just seem like old news that it is weird, but it is like an affirmation of faith in America. This is a real part of the American faith now, and the American dogma that we must end racism. It's the worst thing in the world. It's kind of like if you lived in, say, like a Soviet Union or something, and they had like their sports teams, and they would have something like down with the imperialism in the somewhere in the soccer stadium or the football stadium or the hockey ring. They would have something like that, and it was just an affirmation of their belief in communism in a totalitarian state. And we sort of have that in America with the BLM stuff, and it's really been built in, and sometimes we just don't notice anymore. And it's now like that with the NFL, because we have, I mean, most people work normal jobs. Believe it or not, we don't have DEI training at highly respected industries, but I imagine at other jobs, they have this DEI stuff, this training. There's they now have to go and have a PowerPoint special on George Floyd, and our games have these anti-racist messages and stuff, and it's a real affirmation of the ideological superstructure of America with this stuff. And I think for a lot of people, I guess the one the black pill is that this stuff is also apparent that we don't really notice it, but the white pill in that is that we really haven't taken to it, or at least most people haven't. It's not so much like a silent majority that like rejects it. It's something different from like the late 60s, where if they saw this stuff, people got really violently mad, and that's also why they were fighting, beating the crap out of hippies and stuff, and then voting for Richard Nixon and George Wallace, and backing police brutality against protesters and other things. There was a real silent majority that they would get really offended with this. Here, it's more of an apathetic majority. I've sometimes called it a complacent majority, but with here, it's just like, the awkward. They're just looking around. They're not really into the black national anthem. It hasn't really been adopted by the American people, but it's just like a shrug of the shoulders, and that is better than them like proudly all like these white people really getting into lift every voice and sing, which is the black national anthem. Most people don't even know it, so that's another positive moment. So those are just some initial thoughts on the Super Bowl. Now we're going to get to the tie-in with Biden, as Biden decided to play into the theories the conservatives were promoting, that the deep state was Taylor Swift's a deep state agent, and this is all rigged in favor to help Biden. And Biden had a Dark Brandon meme of like, just as we planned with the game, like implying that they rig it, trying to joke that it was. They really are trying to lean into it, but it is like funny because with the Biden stuff. Because just last week he was ruled too mentally incompetent to stand trial. So we'll get into that. But the one last thing I want to say that's like directed to the Super Bowl, it probably is not good for the right to fully go into this anti-Swift, anti-NFL mode. Now, this is like already going to sound like a cuck, but I think for political purposes, like pragmatic political purposes, like I think there's lots of legitimate criticisms. I made lots of legitimate criticism of the NFL. I think with the dissident right, I think there's much more of an argument you can make for not watching the NFL. But then when the mainstream right and dissident right were refusing to watch the NFL in the late 2010s over the anthem protest, it was sending a hard message to the NFL to stop allowing this stuff, and we're not going to appreciate this stuff. And the ratings fell, and then the NFL tried to pressure players to not kneel for the anthem. And so it had an effect, but, the NFL got woker after George Floyd, and then conservatives have returned. And you haven't really seen the boycott effect now, even though a lot of conservatives are up in arms over Taylor Swift. And even NFL fans are really upset about Taylor Swift. People aren't turning off the game. Like, people are watching the game. People are tuning in. They're still buying merchandise. They're just maybe grumbling about it a little bit more. Difference from 2017 when they were actually turning off the game and the ratings, took a significant dive. But now, and it's something with like Americans, there is a point where liberals love this argument that they can claim that like the right are weirdos, and they think that they can have a good point with like the Taylor Swift stuff and everyone being anti NFL. And the New York Times had an article with this horrible woman, Jane Coaston, who is at one point in time she was trying to be the ombudsman. An ombudsman is like a newspaper where they're like maintaining the standards and seeing what's too partisan or not, and they're like, they're the watchmen of the newspaper. And the ombudsman, she tried to appoint herself as the ombudsman of the right, is like, oh, that's too racist. Yeah, oh, that's too racist. She believes that she's like some southerner and stuff. I think she's like from the north. She's mixed race. And she still tries to do this, but there's like fewer far right-wing figures that interact with her. In like 2018, 2019, Ben Shapiro and a ton of major figures would be like, oh, Jane Coaston, we love you. Oh, okay, we'll try to do better. We won't try to be racist or hateful. And she would just like act to correct the mainstream right. And they were allowing her to have this position. She no longer has this. But she did have this interview with Charles C. Cook, I think it's Charles C. W. Cook. He added even another initial, who's one of the editors at National Review, over how weird the right is for being anti-NFL and anti-Taylor Swift. And they're both lamenting as like, these people are just political extremists. They want everyone to be miserable and be focused on politics. And they're like, y'all, they're so weird. And this woman's like a mixed race fat, a lesbian, and not at all normal. I mean, if people saw her on the street, she has a goofy haircut, not a normal person. But a lot of people want to insist that they're the normal people, all political sides. No matter how weird you are, everyone insists that they're the real normal people. So even like some transgender Antifa DSA member will insist they're the normal one, and the right wingers are the weirdos, and etc. And mainstream right conservatives will insist that everybody. The main one, the weird thing about politics is like everyone's trying to recreate high school with like, oh, I'm the normal, I'm the cool one, and maybe that's not how it is in real life. But she's able to do this, and they were like saying that how weird it is, and etc. And I mean, they were exaggerating the effect, and it's also something that they were any legitimate criticisms you make of the NFL for being engaged in it. They also dismissed the bread and circuses. Like, how could someone say this? Like, say that in real life, and they would have beat your ass. And they're both saying this, and neither one of them is like a normal American. I mean, Charles Cook is a British expat who lives here, so they're not really quite middle Americans. They're trying to assimilate into middle America, but they were making this point about it being too weird and whatever with this. And she even had these like idiotic takes. She was quote tweeting about how people like, this is unironically my patriotism, and it's talking about how like some guy was talking about how he loves listening to Philly sports radio, and somebody with a thick West African accent is complaining about the Eagles, and this is apparently what American nationhood is, and it got thousands and thousands of likes and stuff. It's grim stuff out there for the sports fan. Like when you actually interact with people with sports bios, with sports teams in their bios, usually the most loyal foot soldiers of the regime and believe all the stuff. They're like, Martin Luther King's a hero. Like, racism is the worst thing. We need more diversity. Diversity is our strength. And you'll generally, if you see any person with these like most NPC political takes that are just like reaffirming the dogmas of the regime, you can rest assured they probably have like an Eagles or Bucks or some other team in their bio. It's very unfortunate. And a lot of our side wants to, and also in part with the far right and dissident right's pursuit of trying to claim that they're the real normal people and they were all varsity athletes in high school. They want to say like, actually all sports fans are right wing, and interacting with them on Twitter, I don't know if they're not really like leftists and Antifa. They're just NPCs, and NPCs in America, the great normies generally have a lot of liberal views now and are very, they're not very red-pilled, so to speak, which I think defeats some of the dissident rights things. But that's another point in the story. The main thing I wanted to get, that was a long-winded thing on the New York Times, is that I think, and among ourselves, there's a lot of legitimate criticisms, and there's like the bread and circuses stuff. I think it's fine, but it comes a bit weird when it goes to the level of Benny Johnson and them, because that is what has an effect on on our political leaders, our actual politicians, and is what is the message that is being spread from the mainstream right. And if the liberals and or normies or whatever want to see what conservatism is saying, and we're now saying the NFL's bread and circuses because a white pop star is dating a white NFL star, and this is all a plot to a Pentagon plot to elect Biden. That does come off as very weird to people, and it does. And Taylor Swift is very popular in America generally, and I've always said this in multiple articles, even an article last week about Taylor Swift Republicans versus or Taylor Swift Democrats versus cat turd Republicans, is that she comes across as wholesome and inoffensive. And generally the people who really, really hate Taylor Swift in America, who are not on Twitter, generally it's like a non-white left-wing thing to hate her because they hate that she's so white-coded and so conservative-coded, even though her politics are liberal. A lot of liberals will go to the concerts and see that traditional gender norms are there. There's not a lot of trans people. There's not... people are not dressed weird. It's generally people dressed normal, and it's extremely white, and that's really off-putting to the left. So outside of Twitter, it's generally mostly, and even on Twitter, there's a lot of people who hate Taylor Swift because of those reasons, that she's too white, too nice-looking, and other things. And now the right is like, we're upset about this. We don't want this. We want more Forgiato Blow and these MAGA rappers with face tattoos. And we want cat turd instead, which is a very different type of culture. I don't think it's a very the type of culture we want, but they are trying to juxtapose that. So it does create a weird off-putting message to people we're trying to reach in politics with this stuff. And as we're trying to reach middle class, white, fairly normal people, and us being extremely anti-NFL, not for like even the real reasons, but just because Taylor Swift, and being anti-Taylor Swift because of like Biden, probably not the smartest political move. I feel like we can make criticisms of her like in our little sphere, but once it becomes a de facto dogma on the right and reaches the level where our political leaders are tweeting about it and posting on Facebook about it, it becomes a little bit of an issue, because we are trying. This is like the middle class whites are the demographic that we're losing badly, and they are determining elections. And adopting this cat turd Republican versus Taylor Swift Democrat model is not the smart way to go. It sucks that Taylor Swift is liberal. We're fine to criticize her, but going a little over top and imagining she's the Antichrist, unironically believing it. Ironic jokes like Nick Adams is doing are fine, but the unironic stuff, which a lot of people are getting into, is a little bit much. And so that leads to issues with politics. And now we will go to Biden running for president, because a lot of people are now, reiterating that he's going to drop out, that they're going to replace him with Michelle Obama or Kamala. And once I always say this point, they are stuck with him. I thought it when he came out at night, when his the court report or the special counsel's report came out on his documents case. And for those who don't know, I mean, just a brief, is that they found that he had a bunch of classified documents they were supposed to have, but his memory was so bad. He could have been lying, of course, but he couldn't remember when his son died, couldn't remember when he was vice president. Very serious lapses in memory, which his advocates and shills are just saying that he was so focused on what had happened to Israel because this happened a day after the October 7th attack, so his mind was somewhere else. And it's like, how can you not remember when your son died and when you were vice president? You're a president of the United States, you're at least supposed to remember this stuff. So it showed like serious cognitive disability. And and the special counsel ruled that, hey, well, we can't really charge him because, they did make some points like, oh, well, maybe it's not really criminal how he stored and maybe his excuse for fine. But the main point, they said we couldn't convict him in front of a jury because they would see a former president, a kindly old former president who suffers from very poor memory, and, he's too unfit to stand trial. And that's why they didn't try the Biden. And it's very bad, extremely bad for your sitting president who's running again to be ruled mentally unfit to stand trial, which is what that report said. There's no other mincing it. That's what the report said. And even the mainstream media is starting to admit that, yeah, this is really bad. Like NBC News, very liberal place, it's not, there's no ever evidence that it's conservative, ran about how devastating this is for the Biden campaign, that they just rule him mentally unfit to stand trial. But he is still, even with that news, they're still going to run him because they don't have anyone else. First off, they have to change all these rules with the primary. It's very difficult to do this stuff at a convention now. And they'd have to convince Biden to drop out. Biden, as I've always made this point, him and his wife are assholes. They are not going to drop out. They are arrogant. The point you can always make from this is how they violently, well, I don't know if violently, but aggressively resisted ever getting rid of their dogs that kept attacking Secret Service and the staff. And they were terrifying Secret Service. Like Secret Service would change their whole plan in the White House to avoid the dogs because the dogs kept attacking them. And they didn't give a shit. They kept the dogs. The only time that they finally got rid of the dogs is that there was so many news reports about how they're attacking everyone and how it's a danger to the White House, and they realized that it got embarrassment. But that's such a small matter for them. A major matter is for them to stay in the White House. And Joe Biden wants to stay there. Joe wants to stay there. What is going to convince them to drop out? Nothing. They think that Joe Biden is more electable than his vice president. Probably true. A senile Joe is more electable than Kamala. Kamala, the Democratic establishment doesn't like Kamala. They all see her as terrible, like anti-charisma. Every time she goes out in public, she makes a fool of herself. No one's going to vote for her. And they can't blame this on mental cognition problems. And she has like the lowest approval rating of any vice president in American history. So that's not somebody. They can't just like pick someone from one of these governors or senators. They can't just like pick, Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer, because then that would piss off other people. Like, why am I not getting this? And if they did have to go to a convention and they didn't have anyone, I mean, Dean Phillips is the only person still running against him. Dean Phillips has I don't think he has any delegates. I mean, he may have won like some from New Hampshire, maybe one. I don't know. I don't think he did. But they don't want Dean Phillips. And so they would have to go to a convention and have a vote there. And this is only if Biden cooperates in dropping out, which probably won't. I've always made these points, is that Woodrow Wilson had a stroke in 1919. And he didn't even run the country for the last year and a half. For several months, his wife and his secretary ran the country. He was too incapacitated to do this. And even once he recovered enough to be able to talk and attend to meetings, still not in strong shape. But even after the stroke, which he could barely walk around, not his brain function, his ability to speak were severely diminished, he still wanted to run for president. And he put his name out to run for a third term. And Democrats, the only reason he wasn't nominated is because Democrats are like, we don't think he can run. And he kept his name in there. There's even an example from the 1824 where William Crawford had a stroke before the election. And, this time, it was before mass media, so they weren't like taking, no cameras back then. And some people were wondering, it's like, is his health good enough? And then people met him like, oh God, he's like completely incapacitated. He can't be president. But people still voted for him. He still stayed in the election and he still took votes, despite the fact that he was like clearly in no physical health to do this. And then, and he was one of the many people who ran in 1824. A lot of people ran. That's for another topic on that discussion. And then Roosevelt in 1944 was on death's door the whole year. He nearly died at the beginning of the year for heart problems and numerous health issues. He was a dying man. He still ran for president despite being a dying man because he felt like there's no one else in the Democratic Party who can do this, and I'll just run. And they all realized like he had little time left in his life. He gave the shortest inauguration speech, and everyone who was there seeing his inauguration, because they had hid a lot of him at a lot of times, they prevented a lot of the media from seeing him and seeing him up close. And they saw him at inauguration. It's like, dear, they all thought he was like a cadaver at this point. So this shows that in the past, like when people had serious health issues, they still ran for president. And Biden, unless he has a stroke, I do think if he does have something like Woodrow Wilson or FDR, which it makes them look like they're dying. And the fact is, we have mass media at this point. Cameras are going to capture it. If he's like there being rolled out in a wheelchair and he's like, talking at the side of his mouth, he probably would have to drop out. I don't think, if he didn't drop out, they would nominate Trump because it'd be so bad to elect a little cadaver. That would be the only point. But as long as he just stays reasonably physically, he can walk around and talk. It doesn't matter if he's making massive mistakes in, calling the president of Egypt, the Mexican president, Sisi. It doesn't matter if he's thinking of Angela Merkel as German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, which I don't know how you mix that up. He's also dead. Macron as Mitterrand, which I guess there is one like a justification for that because Macron, Mitterrand. If you're an old man, you maybe mix up the names. He could have thought it was Macron. You could say, oh well, he just mixed up the names, even though Mitterrand's been dead for nearly 30 years. Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel are two different genders and look very much alike and have no similar name whatsoever. And they did belong to the same party, but there's no similarities between that two. And that's really bad that he would say this. And we're just going to witness this more. But he's still more electable than Kamala. They don't want a chaotic convention where they just have to figure this out. I don't think the party bosses just can pick someone. They'd have to have like a floor delegation. I don't know. It'd be a very weird scenario where they'd have to return to the old type of primaries pre-70s where just this stuff was determined in a convention. And that would rub people the wrong way because they're like, well, we picked Biden. And the only way that can occur if Biden drops out, but it would really have to be a serious health problem, like a stroke, that prevented him from walking around and really actually talking. It does, as long as he talks and he mixes up shit and thinks he's been talking to dead people, doesn't matter. They're still going to run him. He's still more electable than Kamala, and he himself and his wife will never want to drop out unless there has to be something. Even the Hunter Biden threats are not enough to make them drop out. So, and I don't think Jill Biden cares about Hunter Biden, but Joe might. But Joe is such an asshole, he probably doesn't give a shit. So that's like something Democrats are stuck with Joe. They cannot replace him with Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama is like the most ridiculous thing. I know the betting markets are placing bets on Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama is not going to run for president. She doesn't like politics. She doesn't like electoral politics. She hated being she only liked being on the campaign trail when people were not criticizing her and they were just cheering for her. She really hates criticism. She does not like the bread and butter politics of just shaking hands and meeting with people and having to make negotiations with others. She really hated that in the White House when Barack would have to make compromises and negotiate with people that he hated. Michelle Obama is just like, fuck you, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. And she really got mad about any media criticism of her or criticism from other politicians. It really drives her, it gets under her skin. She only wants like a politics where everyone agrees with her. She doesn't have to make any compromises or deals with people, and she doesn't have to deal with anyone she doesn't like, which that's impossible in politics. So she really doesn't enjoy it. She has a lot of popularity, but she's never going to do this. She doesn't like politics, and it's just a theory. And all the people who say Michelle Obama are not coming from liberal politics, it's all from right-wing commentary. The only people who are saying this stuff are right-wing commentary. It's all conservative commentary. Which, as I've pointed out, conservative commentators don't get anything right in politics. They don't know shit. They all thought that DeSantis would win this primary and blowout. They all thought that Trump would never win a single primary. They all thought, even in 2016, they thought that, they're going to replace Hillary with Biden. Biden's going to run. And any time that they made this point, I was like, Hillary would beat Biden in that primary. That's why he's not going to run. She has all the donors that he would have. She has all the advisors and everybody, all that establishment. Democrats are lined up behind her. And Biden doesn't have that. And that's why he didn't run. But conservatives were running, and because it's like an entertaining theory. Like, it's very boring just to think that like Biden is going to be the nominee and just sail on. And for some of them, they were also bored by the fact that Trump's going to be there. They don't want a rematch. They want something exciting and something different in this primary. Some plot twist that could happen to make this more interesting. And it's more wish casting than actual sober analysis of what could happen. And that's just not going to happen with Biden. Biden is definitely not going to be replaced by Michelle Obama. If it happened at the convention, it'd probably be your standard leaders. I don't know what they would do at a convention. My guess, if like it was like a serious health problem, this could happen. Like I don't. He is 81. He is looking horrible. There is they're putting on God knows what drugs to get him to do speeches. There is a good likelihood that he has a serious health problem emerge between now and the convention. And so I don't want to say that they're permanently stuck with him, because I do feel that there is a good chance for a health problem with his current condition. But it'd have to be before the convention. If it does happen before the convention, there is a chance that, they roll him out and they realize like, okay, you're done. But it would have to be him admitting to saying, I'm not running for president anymore. I think Jill, if she saw that he was at death's door, would probably finally relent and they would drop out. And they'd have to pick someone at the convention. I think if they had to pick anyone at the convention, it would just be Kamala, because it'd be like, she's the vice president, running mate, whatever. That's who we're running. That's who we're picking. They line up. They don't want to have a tense, brutal brawl at the convention just a few months before the election. They just line up behind Kamala. And the switcheroo would, there's also Trump's conviction that happened. But if Trump's not convicted and he's running against Kamala, I think it increases his chances of winning. I think he'd much unconvicted and non-convicted Trump against Kamala is actually even better odds for Trump against Biden. And I still think he would win against Biden if he doesn't get convicted. But against Kamala, I would be even more certain that he would win. So that would probably even be better for us. But that's I think it's a lot of at this time, this is my main point. They're stuck with him. And that's, I think Democrats realize there are a lot of issues with that. But the other alternative, the most likely alternative, is probably worse and less electable, which is Kamala. And maybe Newsom or I don't know if Whitmer would be better, but probably Newsom would be better than Biden, just because he can, talk and remember who the French president is, and not mix up Egypt with Mexico. But it's he's got a lot of issues going in the presidency, but it's good for us that they're stuck. I think a lot of speculation is just remarkable wish casting. But in conclusion, I've been repeating myself a little bit, but yeah, as long as he stays relatively healthy, no stroke, no heart attack, no aneurysm or anything that puts him out of commission, he's going to be the presidential candidate. It's even the same with Trump. Even some of these DeSantoids and Nikki Haley's campaign is based on that. They're like, well, Trump's legal problems will maybe force him out. I was even more certain, even last year, I said this last year, I'm even more certain that Trump's going to be the nominee. Trump is the nominee. And legal problems won't force him out. Trump will never also relent in dropping out of the presidential the race. And that's going to be what the hell are they going to do at the convention? When he controls all the delegates, they can't remove him even if he is convicted. So he's going to stay in the race no matter what. So he's the nominee, and so it will be a rematch. And I think that's like a good scenario for us. I think it's probably better. I'm a little bit skeptical of, or not skeptical, but I think it would be tougher. It'd be a tougher race if he went against someone who is not Biden or Kamala on the Democratic side. And so it's better that, he runs against Biden. But it doesn't make the news exciting. It's more exciting to believe that, Biden is going to, take himself out of commission, and then they'll have like somebody else that'll be add a new element to this, a new exciting element. It's like going to see a movie and seeing all the same characters like a sequel. It's like exactly like the first movie. I wanted something different. Or, people want variety and difference in this stuff. And when they have with presidential elections, they're bored by it. So people don't want a rematch. They want something new, pizzazz with this. They wanted a plot twist with the election, but they're not going to get it. And that was just affirmed by like Biden's angry tirade following the special counsel's report. So that is it for all the subjects, the regular subjects. I'm going to have a little bit of a longer talk on Putin's interview because our first question is about Putin's interview. So I'm just going to go off on that question and give my thoughts on it, the Putin-Tucker interview. So as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Convolete option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's highly-respected.com. And make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. So this question comes from K-Max. We always love K-Max's questions. He comes out on the Tucker Carlson interviews. He said, some of the dissident right were disappointed with the Tucker Carlson Vladimir Putin interview. What was your view, and what should have been expected? Do they feel Putin should be the answer to solving the West's problems with immigration, anti-white hate, and sexual degeneracy? Is it too much pressure on Putin? So I think that the interview was fine. I think the more important point is that Tucker Carlson interviews Putin, which is a major news event. It keeps Tucker in the news. It makes him, look like he's a serious person because he's interviewing world leaders, and he's not just some guy on the internet, because most people, just some guy on the internet, can't get an interview with the Russian president. And very few people get this, but I think it's more that Putin didn't quite understand the point of the interview or what should have been the goal. As said, like everyone joked, like the first 30 minutes, and I wrote a column about this, the first 30 minutes is him getting a massive history lesson about Russia and Ukraine's relationship, which some people on our side appreciated. They're like, this is very intelligent and well thought out. And it's, it is remarkable that a world leader would give such a answer and have such a insightful dialogue or monologue on a subject. We can't expect our president to do that. Our president, his history would just, I remember in his first year or two, he would give every world leader the same anecdote about Satchel Paige, who is this black baseball player, which most of these world leaders are like, who the hell is Satchel Paige? They didn't know who this is. And so it's remarkable that Putin would have this much knowledge to just, deliver in a 30-minute monologue. But it's like, who are you communicating to? And some people made these cope answers like, he's communicating to the intellectual elite that watches Tucker Carlson, and those are the people turning in. And it's like, the intellectual elite is not watching Tucker Carlson. Are the people are the people who would understand that monologue, he doesn't really need to win over. Because they're like, some people are like, he's speaking to us, the dissident right. It's like, Putin doesn't need to do much to win over the dissident right. And it's also, what benefit is him to win over the dissident right? We don't have much control over American politics as is. We have a little bit of influence, but not a lot. And he already has them, most of our side, pretty sympathetic to him. And most people have already heard these speeches before, because he's given the long history rant about Ukraine and Russia before in many speeches and in essays he's written. This is already there. He doesn't need to reiterate this point. So that's like one issue. And it didn't communicate, when they're like, why did you go to war with Ukraine? He could have given a much simpler answer that was based on direct history right now. He could have given a brief saying, we've had a long history together. Much of what is Ukraine used to be Russia. He could have given a very much more simpler answer, not going into the Middle Ages, the medieval times of Russian history, and then just said, it's about our security. We made a deal that's saying that they would never join NATO, and all these things that could have been said about, the importance of Ukraine and Russia. And I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's something I haven't heard before. That's something that we don't hear about in our media. But he went along with this, the history monologue direction to which most people would just tune out. I think also another problem is Putin was too eager to own Tucker with a lot of stuff. One was it's like an alpha move to first off do a 30-minute monologue that Tucker didn't want to hear. It was like him trying to own and dominate Tucker. He also made Tucker wait for 2 hours allegedly before coming to the interview, but he does that to everybody. He does that to world leaders. The only person he doesn't do that to is Xi, because Xi has he makes sure he's going to be loyal to Xi. Also, I think Erdogan made him wait awkwardly one time for a meeting, probably because Putin is notorious for it. And they had all the cameras there, and I'm pretty sure it was Erdogan. And, Putin's kind of just standing there awkwardly as the cameras are there, and Erdogan then shows up a bit later. It's a way, it's a very, I don't know if American leaders do that too much, but it's a very common thing among a lot of the other world leaders is to do that. Putin's is notorious, and I think Merkel had problems with dogs, and he would make sure to bring a dog to their meetings to make her uncomfortable. So he's a little bit too eager for this. And it's like, Tucker's a relatively sympathetic journalist. You're not trying to, own him, this guy, which kind of undermines your ability to reach the audience you want is if you're just owning your interviewer. And then he, said thankfully you didn't join the CIA, but we know the CIA is a serious organization. That's a really cutting remark to Tucker. The other incidents which he did is it's not Putin's fault because they're talking about Christianity and stuff, and then he's like, "Do you believe?" And Tucker's like, "Do you believe the supernatural is at work in the world?" And Putin was like, "What?" And he's like, "No." Which most American leaders are like, "Yes, the UFOs are demons," and all this stuff. Which if he was interviewing some of the average Republican lawmakers, they would say yes. But Putin's like, this is wild. No, people aren't going to take me seriously if I think that demons are floating around and coming to us in UFOs and all this other stuff. So he knows he has to seem like a reasonable statesman, and that's not what a reasonable statesman would say. So that was a funny part, but I just don't think Putin really approached it in the way that he should. It was going to reach a ton of people. It was, because it's on Twitter, it did reach a lot of people. And some people are always arguing that it definitely reached the intellectual elite. But nobody's going to tune in for the 30-minute rant. I think most people just saw clips from it. And I think for our audience, they would have enjoyed some of it. But it is what it is. I think it was a missed opportunity for Putin. I think he should have. But I think Putin, he's like an unquestionable leader in Russia. He feels like, I'm going to do something my way. I don't really care about tailoring it to other people. And it's his one chance with Western media. And I think he's just really fed up with Western media and how they've covered the war, that he just decided to unleash it on Tucker and trying to own him and alpha dog mode with Tucker, which is probably not the right approach. So it's still an interesting interview. I think it was still good for Tucker in that regards, but I don't think it was the best interview that Putin should have given. And to the last question, do you feel that the Putin should be the answer to solving the West problems? No, he's not really the answers to the problems. One, he's very limited in what amount of control he can have over the West. Some people have criticized my takes on how the Ukraine war has gone. The real loser in this war, no matter what happens, is Ukraine. Ukraine has had their population depleted. Half their country is ruined. At least half their country is ruined from the war. they've lost, like, just like throughout migration, they've lost nearly 20% of their population, if not more. And then they've lost like a huge chunk of their fighting age young male population in this war. And what is going to be the result of it is like a ruined nation with hardly any people and a fertility rate in the toilet. So they're like, we're protecting Ukraine, but at the end of the day, like, Ukraine isn't really a country anymore. It's just kind of this ruined wasteland with these corrupt oligarchs running it, and and all these people are gone. They've just left to the West. So what kind of victory is that? So they're definitely the big loser. And I think Russia can be a moderate winner. If they're going to get, like, whatever peace deals happens, they're going to get territory in Ukraine. Now, how much territory makes it seem like a victory? Now, if they get what they've aimed for, what they're aiming for, and what Putin's speeches have said, which is they get Odessa and Kharkov, that would be a clear victory. But they're probably not going to get that. They'll probably just get the 4 oblasts that they've claimed to have annexed. Crimea is recognized as part of Russia. I mean, Crimea is already considered a part of Russia. It's a 4 additional oblasts alongside Crimea, which is something. It's not a defeat, but it's very much less than what they expect. I mean, the war initially, as they sent guys to Kiev, I mean, even though several people who think that everything Putin has done is brilliant and on schedule and on a plan, they tried to knock out the government in Kiev and replace it with a more sympathetic government to return Ukraine to the Russian sphere. That obviously didn't happen. And then they've just been trying to take as much territory as they can get, which they have taken, significant amount of territory, but probably not as much as they would want. And they don't want to risk the type of casualties that would require to take Kharkov and Odessa. I mean, unless there's like a massive just like breakdown in the Ukrainian forces, like they just all flee, and there's like nobody else to cover these casualties, and the West cuts them off, and then they just make a last push to take a lot of these areas. This is probably not going to get what they want out of Ukraine, so they're gonna have to settle for less. But it's somewhat of a win for them. But the big victor is the American Empire, because it is this, the globalist American Empire. They have blown up the Nord Stream pipeline, cutting off their economic connections to Europe in multiple ways, both literally with a pipeline explosion and forcing all these European countries to place sanctions on Russia and to cut off their economic ties, which has like devastated the European economies. They've made Europe even more dependent on America for security and for economic means. They haven't really dealt the devastating economic blow to Russia, because Russia did build up itself to resist the sanctions that would come. But at the same time, they've made Russia even extremely dependent on China and forced them into the Chinese sphere as a junior partner, which even Putin in the interview acknowledged that he's like a junior partner with China, which is, I don't know if that's not really what we want as Western nationalists, because it's making him give less of a shit of building a strong West, but of just being anti-West, because that's more China's goal. Some people may, disagree, but it's not like really what you want. I mean, what you would want is like having Russia have stronger ties with Europe and build a more keyed Europe in that model. But I think that the chances for that are diminished after this war. And Russia and its allies, well, just Belarus, are using immigration as a weapon against the West. They are inviting all these Africans and Arabs to come to Russia, and then they send them across the border into Finland and into some of the Baltic states and into Poland. We really can't support that. It's not a good way. And also there's some reports that they're now repopulating a lot of Ukraine with Central Asians as well. Which, I mean, you can argue they need somebody to repopulate those parts of eastern Ukraine, because they all, people died or fled. So there is like some regards to that. So looking to Putin as the savior of the West, I think that's a mistaken belief. I think we should have cordial ties with him. I don't see him as an enemy or a villain. I think America and the West waging this war was very stupid. I don't think it was really in our interest, and really the result of it is just the destruction of Ukraine and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of fighting age white men, and for in an area of the world where fertility rates are already horrible, and now we ensure that there's all these men who are never going to reproduce ever again. I don't think that's I think that's a terrifying spectacle that's happened. I think it's a catastrophic effect, which is ensure that I don't think Ukraine's going to exist as much of a country after this war much longer due to those effects. And I don't think it was. I think it could have been easily solved with negotiation. So I've always been a supporter of America pushing Ukraine to make a deal and give up territory in that regards. But at the same time that I don't see Putin as a villain or a devil, I don't see him as our savior of any sort. He has his own interests, and those interests he has are not exactly the interests of us. And I think that those interests have been, even after this war, have converged in separate directions, because now he wants to punish Europe, and he sees immigration as more of a weapon to be used against us rather than something that could be restricted. Now you could argue that our own leaders are also eager for immigration in a way, which is true, but so is Putin. So he's not really the guy to look forward to it. It's really up to us, like people of our leaders that we elect. We can't expect a foreign government or foreign leaders to really save our situation. It really have to be people coming from Europe and America who would reverse our situation. And maybe Putin, I think a Russian-led European order that would have been better for us, but the chances of that happening now are much, much less than they were prior to the war. So that's my view on that. It's a little bit controversial with some people, but that's my view, and I'm sticking to it. So we'll move on to some more questions. We'll answer K-Mac's other two questions he has. He has one on this tweet, which was Ben Shapiro talking about inherent group differences. And so K-Max was saying, I feel we have a breakthrough of Al Sharpton calling the border crisis an invasion and Ben Shapiro mentioning innate genetic group differences. However, despite these ideas, the distant right being true, they have no true institutional power. Can we not win the ideas war despite being right as long as Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo get all the money? How should we approach this? With a slow and steady march to the institutions with these ideas, Sharpton and Ben Shapiro espouse? Well, one thing about our Sharpton, I wouldn't put too much weight on it. The weird thing is that black communities are really mad about this because they feel that the migrants are taking money from them, and they're not really turning into anti-immigration. They're just demanding more money. I think there was an example of this when Vivek went last year to Chicago to meet with the black community there about the migrant problem, and he's trying to push immigration restriction to them, and they're like, nah, we just want reparations and we just want more money. And so it's more of just a battle of conflicting interests where blacks are like, we deserve that money, not these migrants. And that's why he's saying it's invasion. It is important to note that how all these figures are coming out against this. Like Stephen A. Smith did a long rant about how much they're spending on migrants. People are really pissed off about this because they know this is cutting into public services. They are in favor of mass immigration in the abstract, but once it becomes direct and affects black communities and starts taking money away from them, then they're just demanding a wall and some more security. And Sharpton's also, figure of the Democratic establishment. He's just saying this invasion. In the time he was saying the invasion, he was also blaming Republicans for not passing the horrible border bill that just cemented the invasion. So I wouldn't say too much about it. Shapiro is an interesting point. A lot of conservatives have been into these ideas for a while because they all read Charles Murray. They've all had a lot of respect for Charles Murray. There's been a few people who have, for various reasons, because racism, worried about getting called racist and other things, that would engage in this. I think Shapiro saying that stuff is a very important move, and that it creates the opening to more openly discuss this stuff and makes it more socially acceptable to say these things. And so I think that's a little bit a bigger deal, and I think it's more of a ideological reason for saying this, or a more moving the Overton window than Al Sharpton. The Al Sharpton calling it invasion is just showing how much immigration is unpopular right now for the whole population, because all these cities are now experiencing mass illegal immigration at a really devastating effect. And that's what's causing all these figures to come out against immigration and saying these things that Sharpton did. But when on the institutional matter, we're making these ideas known through a slow and steady march. And there's something with the institutional power and stuff, but whenever there's some problems with like starting an institution, if you like want to have an old magazine and then it's like openly, then they condemn it as racist and stuff, and then they can consign it to, the ghetto of some sort. There's always those issues, but we are getting our ideas more and more out there, and people are interacting with these ideas more than ever before, ever in my lifetime. So we are having a positive effect on that. The real question is how much of these ideas are then filtering down to the general public, and how much is this helping us win elections, which that will be remain to see in November. There were a lot of arguments about making institutions. There are some issues with making institutions that are explicitly in our favor of our views, because it makes them easier to deplatform and shut down, as what we're seeing with, unfortunately, with VDARE right now, that the New York AG is coming down hard on them just because of their immigration views, and, she's wielding state power against them. That's the type of stuff you have to deal with if you have an openly identitarian group, an institution, when it's there, is that you're open yourself up to those type of attacks. So in some ways it's a little bit better to have a guerrilla type war where you have individuals not directly tied to an institution of traditional institution of sort, who are just pushing these ideas through social media, through YouTube, through Twitter, through Substack, and due to the popularity of these ideas, and that a lot of their, people, Shapiro's audience and stuff, they'll be like, why don't you address this issue? And why don't you address this thing? And then they eventually come around to it. And, and you see what Matt Walsh is saying. He's really saying a lot of stuff that only the alt-right was saying in 2016. Same with Charlie Kirk, same with Tucker, same with Candace Owens. And so much more of the biggest conservative commentators now, especially the ones that reach a younger audience, are saying stuff that only the alt-right was saying and the dissident right were saying many years ago. So that's a positive indication. So that would be my answer on that. We're making a lot of progress, slow and steady progress. And at this point, it's a little bit better to build up a type of guerrilla intellectual activism rather than having a traditional institution, just because of the obstacles and difficulties we face in having a traditional institution. So here's the final question from K-Max. Scott, with lectures by Dante King at University of San Francisco, where he says whites are psychopaths and discusses the delusion and perversion of whiteness. He also claims it's written in the law that you can rape black women. I don't think so. Do we have hope more will be turned over to our side, or do many Generation Z types eat this up with a spoon? My hope is that it's so over the top, many would be turned off and join our side. Your thoughts on this? No, I don't think anyone's into this. I don't think people are into this stuff either. I saw the tweet. It's so over the top that it just pushes people into our direction if they hear this. If this is like what is the counterpoint to the right, then people will then be more interested in what the right has to say. So it's better that you have people like this saying this ridiculous stuff than that. A lot of my intellectual journey was hearing the crazy stuff in college and sociology classes where they're like, only whites can be racist, and black crime is just caused by their circumstances, and a lot of that stuff just made me more right wing hearing in college. And I think that's an effect on a lot of people. I think that some people just shrug their shoulders and just like whatever, they don't care. But that stuff it's so over the top, it's so vitriolic that it doesn't help their side. The real issue comes with the more moderate people who are just like, whiteness is corrupt. They're not saying whites are psychopaths or whites are evil, but they're just saying whiteness and white privilege are really explain a lot of the things in this country. Explains why there's such a high crime rate among blacks, because they don't have all this privilege. I think when it's more of an issue when it's said in a moderate and appealing tone than when it's said in the way that Mr. King said it at the University of San Francisco. We want more people to say like it Mr. King, the way that Mr. King says it. But when you have a more sober approach to it, that's when it becomes a problem. That's when people eat it up, and they are more likely to embrace those stupid ideas. So that would be my answer to that. Now we've got to go to Mystery. Mystery's got a few questions. Let's see. He said a couple of questions. How much value do you place on term limits as a reform to keep new blood and ideas going into Congress? Similar to the theory that science progresses one death at a time. I actually think term limits are stupid. I think it's kind of a waste of time. People really don't like this as a knee-jerk populism as a way, because we think that like, oh, people are in Congress too long. But in a lot of ways, you want long-term lawmakers to be there so they have more power to stop bad legislation and push good legislation. It really wouldn't solve anything by just taking old dinosaurs out. We think in our minds that, okay, we wouldn't have McConnell and stuff, but it would create a more chaotic Congress where more people really could not get anything. I mean, Congress really doesn't get anything done at this point, but it'd be even more chaotic. It'd be more people just like grandstanding the whole time. And if they only have 2 terms, they're not about to try to do anything to fix this. It really wouldn't fix any of the problems with Congress. Congress got more done under the old system where it's... all right, I got to rephrase this. I would say, when we didn't have quite term, there was no, demand for term limits and stuff, and some of these congressmen didn't really get as much media attention. They were more willing to do stuff. Now, the problem is a lot of things they were doing were terrible. So the only reason you would want to support term limits is not that it would make Congress better, but it would make it even more chaotic, and that it would get even less done. And a kind of accelerationist argument, which I don't know. You still want the semblance of a serious legislative body, but without term limits, it would totally diminish that. I think, but a lot of what people want from like we get rid of term limits and now they actually do stuff, they'd actually do even less than that, and they would be even less inclined to actually solve real problems with these with that being taken away. And so it really wouldn't solve our issues with term limits. So I'm not that keen on it. I think it's just one of these easy populist moves which people want to, and Trump does it, but people are like, people spend too much time in D.C. They need to get a real job. And then they're like, oh, I like that my congressman's there so he can get more rewards from my district and other things. It would make it. We'd probably eliminate a lot of pork barrel spending, on all these district things. But that would probably make a lot of people happy in their districts who are like, "Hey, we thought we'd get a new bomb factory or something, and we're not getting that anymore." So I think some people would come to regret that. So yeah, I'm not. In conclusion, not that keen on it. Okay, so his other question: the border bill is horrible. After all these years of Trump, are its GOP supporters in Congress still simply addicted to cheap labor? Is there any other motivation? I think it showed a lot of progress for Republicans, because the vast majority of Republicans rejected it. They didn't even put it to a vote. They cut it off. There was the bad thing that they're like, well, they put all this, massive foreign aid spending, which is still not good. But having just the foreign aid spending without the border security, which, all these GOP senators promised there'd be border security, it's probably better than the border bill. And the GOP can't get their shit together to agree on some border security changes. I mean, it's a leaderless caucus, especially within the House. So if you had to choose between the foreign aid bill and the terrible border bill, you would probably say, well, whatever, fine with a foreign aid. You would say ideally you would want neither. But and you're going to see a lot of opposition in the House. Maybe in the House they'll kill the foreign aid bill, which may lead them to go back to doing a border secure. The GOP insists on like one or two changes to the border that have no negative effects, like the border bill had. That would be a positive development, but I'm a little skeptical of that. But on the motivations, yes, a lot of these guys are addicted to cheap labor. They have all these corporate donors, especially in the agricultural industry, that want more foreign labor. All these businesses just want foreign labor, and their donors are like this. And so that's a huge motivation. And also the motivation is that a lot of these establishment Republicans still have this fantasy of working across the aisle with Democrats to really solve the problems of America, which is just stupid. That's just not going to happen anymore. And generally when they did try to work across the aisle, there was terrible ideas, from amnesty that they were trying to push in the 2000s and 2010s, the Immigration Act of 1990, which greatly increased immigration, war authorization that has allowed the president to invade Iraq and other things, Civil Rights Bill of 1991 that expanded. Most of these bipartisan bills of the last 40, really 60 years have been just terrible. So it's probably better that they can't work across the aisle. But all these guys really hyped up on this fantasy of, yes, I can't wait to do this. I can't wait to sign up for this, which I think is bad. So, but it's still a good thing. I don't want to get that black-pilled about it. The fact that the GOP, they introduced this bill and the entire GOP rejected it. And this bill is still an improvement over what the type of deal they would have tried to done 5 years ago, where they would have tried to insert amnesty and stuff. It's still a terrible bill, but it's probably relatively less terrible than what they would have tried to do 5 years ago. I think it's all starting to, improve the party and push the party in our direction still. So I don't want to be too black-pilled about it. And then he's like, please tell me Tim Scott won't be VP. I don't think he'll be picked for VP. I would say he's a more realistic idea than Vivek and definitely Tucker, but he's not going to be it. Because Trump wants somebody who will ardently defend every decision he's done. He wants somebody say 2020 was a rigged election. Tim Scott won't say that. Tim Scott won't defend Trump's actions on January 6th. Others will. At least Stefanik defended Trump's actions on January 6th and openly says the 2020 election was rigged. Which there's a lot of problems with Stefanik. Most of her other politics besides defending Trump are terrible. But she's willing to go the extra mile to defend Trump. Tim Scott doesn't want to do that. Tim Scott does not want to be that defense, play that strong of defense for Trump. And Trump realizes that, and he's probably not going to pick him as VP. It's a realistic one, but there's so many other people that he would choose. He's got Sarah Huckabee Sanders. He's got Stefanik. He's got Noam. Haley is a very unrealistic because Haley is staying in the primary longer than she should, and that's really aggravating Trump. And she's now running these attack ads on Trump, utilizing liberal media hit sound bites about, he attacked my husband, blah, blah, blah. And also the fact that Trump World is, was pushing that she's been cheating on her husband and other things. He was not going to pick Haley. Scott is more likely than Haley, but I would not put him in the top category. I would say Stefanik, Noam, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. I would probably even say J.D. Vance is more of a likely candidate. Zeldin's probably more likely than Scott. But he is in the 10 realistic picks. He would unfortunately be in there, but I don't think he will be picked. So I'm giving you multiple white pills. I'm going to say he's not going to be VP. So we're going to go back to our other questions. Let's see who to pick. We'll go with Dollar Bill. He said, history question. Were plantation owners in the antebellum South like how they are depicted in fiction? They're shown as swaggering around, dressed like Colonel Sanders, holding grand balls in their homes, talking a southern accent so thick you could spread it over toast, and relaxing on the porch watching the field hands pick cotton while enjoying a mint julep. They come across as very colorful individuals, the evils of slavery notwithstanding. Did people back then dream of owning their own plantation and becoming one of the planter elite, kind of like how people today aspire to become famous musicians, movie stars. Definitely in the South, they aspired to do that. That was like the life goal. That was like making it. But with the planter elite, there was differences in how many owns slaves. Like if you the type of planter elite mindset they have is like the guys who own like 50 to 100, and that was like a very small number of Southerners who owned as many slaves as that. They were not quite these old school, aristocrats that they made themselves out. They really depicted them in fiction like this because the Tidewater, Virginia, and coastal South Carolina were really into this image of this as like this old aristocracy that's much more like Europe, and they're having these ways, aristocratic ways and noble ways, and they're holding these grand balls, and they're not a part of this frivolous capitalist system. But the rest of the South and the real money makers, which were in the deep South of South Carolina was, but the real like black belt of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, those guys were more like modern capitalists and running their plantations like capitalists. They're making sure everyone's working on time, and there was some similarities to the factory owners in the North and how they were running their plantation, and was quite not the stereotype. Yeah, I think it's a little bit. They of course had very thick Southern accents, and I think a lot of them enjoyed mint juleps. But I think the kind of planter aristocrat image is not really true. There's a great book on this, The Ruling Race, by Stephen Oakes, I think is his last name. I'm going to double check that. James Oakes, not Stephen Oakes. James Oakes, Ruling Race. He's a pretty famous historian with us. That's a very good book because it counters a lot of the notions that the South was like this agrarian feudal economy, when in fact a lot of these plantation owners were very much capitalists themselves and how they ran things and what they were desiring. And it's not all that they were having balls and dressing up like knights and having jousts, which there were parts of the South that were having this, but that wasn't all the South. So that's an interesting book to read and learn what the planter elites were like. So that is my answer to that question. So we got a pretty good one from a dollar bill. Now we're going to go to John. John asks, I just started finished reading Strong Boy, The Life and Times of John L. Sullivan. He was the first heavyweight champion in the United States in the 1880s. The thing that surprised me the most was the stories of all the people losing their life savings on gambling. And can carry on reading the question. The referees were gambling, the managers were gambling, and of course all the fans were gambling. There is even a story of a man in John L. Sullivan's corner in a prize fight in France who lost his life savings on the fight because John L. didn't win fast enough, but continued to act as a stool for John to sit on his back in between rounds in the mud-filled fields. Why was gambling so common, and what caused its decline and resurgence? Gambling's always been very common. It's a very masculine activity because it's a way of just showing you're willing to take risks. It's like, hey, I'm willing to bet all my money on the line. How about you? It's a way of like showing off and very masculine behavior. And it's about, I'm taking a risk and I win and I own you for taking this risk. I'm right. And so it's a very high risk, high reward behavior that men really like to engage in. So it's always been there. And, there wasn't as much entertainment at the time. So gambling gave them some excitement and added some pizzazz to their life. But a lot of people became addicted to the adrenaline rush of it. And like a lot of other risky behaviors, like high-speed driving or something, people really got into it. And so it was extremely common. I don't know if it ever really had a decline. It's just that we were more restricting it and making it, had much stricter criminal penalties about it since the 19th century. But now it's come back because we're now eliminating the restrictions. And so a lot of guys now dedicate their masculine passions to sports betting online, and it's much more and it's a lot different than before. I think a lot of gambling that occurred was among friends. It was over cards, it was over maybe they were watching the game and they bet $20 and throw it in, and it was, I think, a much more of a kind of a community behavior. But it could also be a very negative community behavior because all these guys they could lose all their money and they no longer can take care of their family, and then they're just compulsive gambling. And compulsive gambling is a very devastating habit. I'm not actually that big of a fan of gambling. I understand why people gamble. I understand the masculine appeal of it, but compulsive gamblers, it's like an extreme problem. I mean, that's like the problem with all addictions, but like gambling addiction could literally cost you everything in a way that I don't think alcoholism can. Alcoholism has a lot of problems like health problems, but gambling, you're still, you're wasting all your family's money, throwing away all these things that people depend you on, and you just got to keep going with it, and then you become massively in debt. And at the time when organized crime was involved in this, it could end up with your life lost, or at least some serious injuries. So I think, yeah, it's a resurgence is all due to a greater legalization of it. And in America, we're sort of there's this point where we're a little bit of a libertarian paradise. We're now drug legalization, gambling legalization. All these vices are open to Americans now that they were not 30, 50 years ago. And now all these people just engage in it, and we're very much a culture of vice and pleasure where you can just get on your phone, order weed, watch some horrible pornography, and place $100,000 bets. There's somebody who's telling me the story that a friend of theirs was working in a soup kitchen, and some woman who came to the soup kitchen had bet $500 on the Chiefs in all their playoff games, and she made $1,400 from it. And she had placed it on her credit card, yet she was still at a soup kitchen. Very much an American moment. So that's something I actually do think that there needs to be more restrictions on gambling because people just become too addicted to it, and they forego other things that they should be focusing on. And it really is an opiate that it ensures that they're not focusing on important issues, and they direct all their passions and aggression towards just gambling, and then they just don't care about the world around them. So that would be my answer to that question, to John's question. Now we're going to get the other John Chandler, who asks, what are your thoughts on Bukele, his king-size win in El Salvador, and his base victory speech from the balcony of the presidential palace? Should we be worried about the gay trying to undermine him? Are there any lessons we American right-wingers can draw from his story? Granted, El Salvador and the U.S. are very different countries, but it is hard not to see this as a major white pill. I think it's all great what Bukele is doing, because even just from an American perspective, we want Latin American countries to be like this. We want them to be safe and stable, so their people are not all trying to flee to our country. And if more of Central America was like El Salvador, we would not be having the immigration problem. And so that's like a very good thing about Bukele. And I also do like the idea that, we can easily solve crime through law and order, through arresting criminals. So it definitely undermines the claims of these liberals who are like, this isn't how we solve crime. And then Bukele's like, actually it is. We just throw them all in jail. And Salvadorans are very, some of the election might have been a little rigged by how overwhelming the result is, but Salvadorans are overwhelmingly in favor of Bukele because they see that the country, had one of the highest murder rates in the world, and now it's pretty safe. And so they all appreciate that, and that also makes them less likely to try to go to America. So it's all very good. But drawing lessons from it, we probably couldn't do that stuff here. One, like Constitution, we're also the United States of America, and also if we had those images of our criminals, they would all be of a certain race that a lot of Americans worship, and it would create a lot of hysteria and outrage. So you really couldn't bring those ideas to America. I mean, the real thing is like El Salvador is a country that had civil war and political chaos throughout its history. It's not really had very stable regimes. People don't really care about the law and Constitution that much. And so you could just arrest criminals and put them all in jail. And if America did that, I always said if that America did this, it would not be directed towards criminals. It would be directed towards incels, because that would be the only demographic that you could get a vast majority of Americans to support putting them in prison camps. So we would see all these poor incels like lined up, like those like MS-13 members and stuff, and put in a prison camp. And America would be very happy about that. So that if we ever did try to implement that, it would go after political dissidents and incels and people that a lot of that the liberal media can be whipped up into, and the consumers of it can be whipped up into supporting. So Trump can't really do this, but I think on a smaller scale of just simply we need to be tougher on crime and arrest criminals and put them in jail, I think that's an example we can draw. But in terms of arresting all people accused of crime and then putting them in indefinitely in prisons, we can't really do that. And if any group we did that against, it would be incels and racists probably. So I think that is it, except for New England refugee, which we always like to end on New England refugee. If there was any questions I missed, always make sure to send me a reply and say, hey, I got this question. Because sometimes, things get lost in the pile. Also, you have to make sure the question is in the email you send me, because I get a lot, and I make sure that I get all the questions by just seeing who marked questions. So, New England refugees with the last question. He says, I was always fascinated by Article 5 of the Convention of the States. It seems like if we were ever able to get 34 state houses to pass the resolution, 18 have, we could remake the country in our image and ignore big dim states like Illinois, California, and New York. Is there any chance you see this happening, or is it just a pipe dream? No, I don't really see it happening. I mean, we can't... I don't think we have 34 states we can ensure have this. And if we did... They don't really have quite the ideas. I remember when this was an idea 10 years or 11 years ago, actually. This has been an idea for a while. And they're like, what should we eliminate? And they're like, we need to eliminate popular election of senators and return it to the state legislatures. And I was like, actually, that would probably ensure we even have worse senators. We have more people like Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn and these idiots who are pushing for this terrible border deal. We'd have fewer people who are willing to voice the will of the base, like some of the Tommy Tuberville, and even with Josh Hawley has some cringe behavior, and so does Ted Cruz, but they're still better than the establishment guys and JD Vance and people like that. So that was like the only concrete idea I ever heard from them, was just to eliminate popular election of senators and return the old way. And I don't think that's really there. I think you would have... There has to be, the Convention of the States is an idea in search of a purpose. You have to have a purpose of what you're trying to accomplish. Is there a specific amendment that you want to have that can be done with the Convention of the States? Or if you rewrite the Constitution, what is your purpose to do this? And I feel like it's just like, we want some vaguely conservative thing to happen, and we'll do this by Convention of the States. And it's always a problem. It's when you have it's a solution in search of a problem, or it's something that it's trying to solve. It's the same with national divorce. It's an idea in search of a motivation, or of what we're trying to solve. And it's like, well, we're tired of libs, so we're just going to have our own country. And it's like, what's that country going to be like? Do you see what these red state governors are doing? Would this actually be better? And so I always see this a lot with conservatives, that they have these ideas that they have, and then it's like, this is what we need. And then it's like, well, what is it trying to accomplish? What is national divorce trying to accomplish? I think people are a little bit better about articulating that, which I think they fail to understand what a lot of red state America is like, and leadership is like, and what red America would be like, would just probably be, there'd be some things better, but there'd be a lot of things a lot dumber in a red state America, and wouldn't fully solve our issues. And a Convention of the States is this fairly radical idea that hasn't really figured out what its purpose is. So, maybe it could be a good idea, but I think it needs a more concrete purpose. But I think it'd be tough to get 34 states together for a purpose that we really agree with. So that is my take on that. And that is it for Highly Respected today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the episode. We're going to have a great IQ supplement and a great article later this week. So be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.